Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, and thank everyone at the Foundation for your hospitality and your partnership. I'm deeply honored to be here. When Stelios invited me to serve as your keynote speaker, it took me about 45 seconds to accept. During the last decade, in my tenure leading Governor's Island in New York City, I worked to imagine and create a citywide public space and an open platform for culture. The conference's topic was, of course, instantly of interest to me. But as I started to write down my thoughts and prepare, I began to have very many serious reservations about standing here. First, of course, we are in Athens. What can any American say to Athenians about the role of public space? We've been having that conversation for a mere 250 years. And that conversation in our country always starts with your agora. Our ideal of a free and open space, a place for social encounters, for the exchange of ideas and commerce and culture, starts here. I was at the Agora again yesterday, and it has lost none of its power as the origin of generations and centuries of thinking about what we all mean by public space. Yesterday was my second visit there, as I had the great privilege of participating in this conference 2 years ago. As I told Vasily when I left Athens on June 27th, 2015, I felt like I had left part of my heart here. I spent the rest of that year and since following the turbulent events that you have actually been living through. So even as we in America are now experiencing our own challenges, I remain humbled and honored to be here, a guest in your country. And I am humbled by this place, by the Stavros Niarchos Cultural Center, by the vision and commitment to create this place, even at a time of such uncertainty and tumult. Andreas and Renzo Piano's shared vision for a 21st century agora, a public space of extraordinary design, culture, and openness, has been realized. I know from my own experience building a space in New York what was required to persevere, and I'm a bit in awe of your unparalleled ambition and achievement. I know that many Greeks have spoken about the center as a powerful icon of hope for your future. Renzo Piano talked about optimism a lot last night in his remarks. I confess that it is not only Greeks who need that extra dose of optimism as we think about the future of public space. I too need more than I did when I was last in your country, and that gave me pause about standing here before you discussing this. Public space is now literally under assault. Manchester, London, Arlington, Virginia, these are just among the most recent cities where citizens enjoying gatherings in public space have been attacked. A concert, a night out at bars, and in Arlington, a baseball game, a nonpartisan baseball game, no less. Incidents of terror, international and domestic. And it is not just the threat of terrorism that endangers public space. In America, we have a long tradition of protecting free speech in the public square, but we now have partisan groups on both ends of the political spectrum who are showing up in those squares not only to challenge speech, but to incite altercations, sometimes with violent consequences. And what happens in physical space, a dispute between students and a professor on a college campus, a phrase from a speech, a production of Julius Caesar in a theater in a park, is instantly streamed, tweeted, snapped, magnified, distorted, and spread in the virtual realm. That virtual realm now more than overshadows the physical realm. With its reach, its speed, its ferocity, it has corrupted the notion of civil discourse, the tradition that was founded in ancient Athens. Ironically, the internet has long been associated with such words as open, sharing, community, connectedness. But now the online world is increasingly associated with divisiveness, not openness. It's now as segregated by ideology as public facilities were segregated by race in the American South more than half a century ago. We are living in our online bubbles and our Facebook echo chambers. The metaphor of a bubble suggesting transparency, ephemeralness, and playfulness does not convey the rigidity and the intensity of our divisions. The virtual walls, which seem built out of material more impervious than the marble used to build the Acropolis, or even the border walls proposed by our nation's president. All of this gave me pause about standing here. How can we talk about ethics and the arts and the activation of public space at a time like this? I say all this to acknowledge the seriousness of the moment, that we don't live in a bubble in this beautiful, spectacular opera house, and to say that we must retain the optimism that was expressed here last night. And I would argue that today's conversation is essential. It is essential because we are gathered together in physical space. Yes, we are being live streamed, but we are here with many exceptional individuals who have traveled a great distance to share their thoughts, to meet with you, and as Stelios has said, to really interact and talk about the future of public space. So to set the stage for my colleagues, I'll take a few moments to talk about what we mean by public space. I'd like to introduce the notion of shared space and to, in fact, share some impressions of two places in America, one I know very well, Governor's Island, and another place that aspires to be our agora, and that hopefully embody why, as Stelios said, the activation of public space through creativity and imagination is of critical importance at this very daunting moment of polarization in our world. And alas, I have to start here. And I'd like to quote an American. Michael Kimmelman, who was on the stage last night, wrote an essay about the meaning of city squares. And I quote, "From the start, the public square has been synonymous with a society that acknowledges public life and a life in public, which is to say a society distinguishing the individual from the state. The agora announced the town as a polis. Even later, as government moved indoors and the agora evolved over time into the Roman Forum, the notion of the public square as the soul of urban life remained critical to the self-identity of the state." The panel that immediately follows my talk will take up this conversation in what promises to be a very provocative discussion. The complete history of public space from the agora to the 21st century is beyond my professional expertise, and luckily for all of us, the time limit I have today. But to understand what we mean today in June 2017, I thought it would be helpful to go back to a quarter century when there was a very different view of what public space meant, certainly in our country. In 1990, Harper's, an American magazine, gathered a group of experts, much like the visitors who have come to Athens today, to debate that very topic. Whatever became of the public square? I'd actually read this article back in 1990 and remembered it and got it from their archive in preparation for this speech. It's a very pessimistic conversation with smart people from architecture and philosophy and the civic space, pessimistic that at that moment in the US, there was even any definition of public space, let alone consensus about why it would be important, and no political will, they all agreed, to design or build new ones. This was just a quarter century ago. In fact, at one point, and this is why I remembered the article, they agreed that the only viable heir to the agora in 20th century America was the New York City subway system. And I quote, "Although the public interaction is inchoate, rolling our eyes together at irate passengers, perhaps even an occasional courtesy, at least the people see one another. Maybe that's enough." To which another respondent answered, "It's great to see different people on the subway, but if that's what the public space has degraded into, it's no cause for celebration. It's pathetic." And those of us visiting from New York can talk perhaps with alcohol at great length about the state of our subway system, but it really was a feeling that that was the democratic realm for our country at that moment. In the conversation, a well-known American architect, Elizabeth Platter Zyberk, comments on public space in the city of Miami, where she is from. She's a well-known founder of a movement called New Urbanism. "We have no continuous urban fabric, so we are constantly searching for that space that has a defined character specific to the place. Our cities come fragmented, our populations come diverse. What we long for in the design of our public spaces and in the character of our public life is not fragmentation and difference, but a sense of what we have in common." I was living in Seattle and on the board of the Seattle Public Library in 1998. Our city built that consensus and political will to build a new library downtown. And the questions that were asked are probably familiar to you at this place. Why would anyone need a physical book, a librarian? Doesn't digital technology, this is almost 2 decades ago, make the library obsolete? We hired the architect Rem Koolhaas, and this is actually from his proposal. And the question he asked us was, can the library compete with the shopping mall as the place where people want to gather? In his proposal, he said, the library represents the last of the uncontested moral universes, the communal accommodations for good or necessary activities. The moral goodness of the library is intimately connected to the value of the book. At the same time, the last decade has shown an accelerated erosion of the public domain, replaced by increasingly sophisticated and entertaining forms of the private. The essence of the public is that it is free. Now it is substituted by accumulations of quasi-public substance that, while suggesting welcome, actually make you pay. The library stands exposed at its most outdated and moralistic, its legacy, as Koolhaas described it to the book, at the moment that has become the last repository of the free and the public. This is the Seattle Public Library. Koolhaas and Platter-Zyberk are designers whose aesthetics, ideologies, and built work could not be more different. But 2 decades ago, Koolhaas's answer to the question, how do we reclaim the public domain, the free and the public, in the form of this building, was also in effect responding to Platter-Zyberk's yearning. What we long for is a sense of what we have in common. This afternoon, 4 designers including 2 extraordinary colleagues of mine from the US, will wrestle with the same question about design in public space. When this building opened in 2004, it was widely lauded. At a dark hour, Seattle's new Central Library is a blazing chandelier to swing your dreams upon. If an American city can erect a civic project as brave as this one, the sun hasn't set on the west. Today, shopping malls are closing. People continue to read physical books, and libraries are engines of reinvention, not only embracing the technology that threatened their obsolescence, but broadening their moral and social purpose. 2 colleagues of mine from the Brooklyn Public Library are here, and of course, the Cultural Center is home, a spectacular home to your National Library. Libraries are vital public spaces here in Athens, in New York City, Seattle, and around the world. And the living room, as Koolhaas named the main space of the Seattle Central Library, is filled with people. I love the use of the word living room, and I want to talk about this as we think about what is public space. So, is public space the subway? Is it buses and bus stops, city streets, plazas? One of our other ideals in America are plazas in Italy, Trafalgar Square, parks, of course, libraries, museums, one of my favorite, the Museum Quarter in Vienna. And public space, of course, can be privately owned. Shopping malls, this one in Asia. And one of the most famous privately owned public spaces in New York City, Zuccotti Park, actually privately owned, although more famous, and probably to be discussed later today, as the home of Occupy Wall Street, a protest that had a big impact in our national dialogue. The use of the term living room demonstrates really the fundamental role of public space in cities, because we live, city dwellers live in the public realm. This is a private living room. And in the suburbs, people may live in private space. But in cities, no matter what your income, your neighborhood, your race, your education level, much more of your life is lived in the public realm. So yes, streets and buses and subways are public space. They're not public space where we gather for recreation and edification, but they are where we spend a lot of our time. And in the last quarter century, we have become a world of cities. 4 years after the Seattle Public Library opened in 2008 was the first year that worldwide the population was split evenly between cities and rural areas. Of course, in the EU and the US, we had already passed that divide many years before. Cities have always been magnets for immigrants and rural dwellers seeking opportunity, as well as places of shelter for the poor. Cities are also engines of innovation, attracting new companies, new investment, new ways of doing business, new ways of learning. And cities have begun to change as more people, more diverse people, have come into the city, raising powerful issues of equity, but also creating a new kind of vitality and need for public space. And unless you live in this $1 billion house in Mumbai, this is a billionaire's home, but the construction cost was $1 billion, you are living your life in the public sphere as a city dweller, and your relationship to other members of the public, as well as to physical space, are fundamentally different. And that public life can be unnerving and stimulating as we encounter the unexpected, but have limited opportunity for refuge. On the streets, free speech is practiced, and you don't have a quiet place to call your own, hence the importance of parks. But as we think about public space in the last quarter century, we have seen an extraordinary profusion of public spaces and parks being built around the world. When I spoke to Stelios about this talk, he asked me if I was going to quote Habermas to you, and instead I'm going to quote a philosopher closer to my heart, Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park. He referred to parks as the lungs of the city. Now, of course, that is literally true, and you'll see in these parks around the world a strong focus on sustainability and the greenness of parks, the addition of trees to provide cover, to clean the air, but it's also about how we as city dwellers can breathe, that respite, that refuge. And as you look at these parks from around the world, you see what new parks and green spaces can do. In Bogota, new forms of transportation with bicycles. In downtown Seoul, the resurfacing of a river that had been buried in cement for years, creating an extraordinary new public space in the center of the city. In Madrid, many kilometers of park and play added, particularly in underserved neighborhoods. In Dallas, Texas, a freeway was lidded, literally, creating a 5-acre, about a 3-hectare park connecting a poor neighborhood to downtown. And of course, in our own city, the High Line, very famous. And a place I know well, Governor's Island. So I'd like to take a moment to show you Governor's Island with a video that was prepared so you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about when I begin to talk about how we use the concept of shared space to create this very new public space in New York City. created this public space, we were coming to a place that in effect, this is not an accident, was a blank. This was a place that had been owned by the US military. And in fact, I couldn't find a picture of the serving military, so on the right, those are actually reenactors from a more recent moment. But it was closed to the public, and it wasn't part of our city's literally physical maps or psychological maps. And it certainly was public. President Bush transferred it to Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Pataki back in 2003. But how do you make a place a living part of a city? How do you make a place that reflects the diversity of the people in your community, as well as in our case and in the case of many cities, the incredible creative energy of our city? Being public, and by what I mean being public, being free and being open to the public, we felt was necessary but not sufficient. And so our philosophy of how we built this place, not literally how we moved the rocks up the hill, although I'm happy to talk about that at another point, but how we made it a place that resonated with our city and truly belonged to the public, was through this notion of shared space. Now, sharing is very simple. It's probably the thing we're taught first as children and that parents teach to their children. How do you share? And of course, we also think of the word share. Ironically, the synonym for that is an equity, a piece of ownership in a stock, a piece of ownership in a company that you literally co-own a company. You own a share. And of course, we share, pizza being the most visual representation of how we share, and then we aspire to sharing together. Breaking bread is at a table when we come together as a family, as a community, with friends. So how does this notion of sharing enter into public space? And when you think about this notion of according a share to another or others, and we made the very conscious decision that as the stewards of this place, working for the elected officials of our city, that we would share in the creation of it with the public and with the many communities of artists and creative people in our city. So we literally shared in its creation. First, we shared in the design. So a member of the public had an idea that hammocks would be a lovely addition to our public space. We were taken with that idea. We went shopping online, just like anyone else. We bought 20 hammocks and we put them out in a public space to see whether people would enjoy them. They were wildly successful, and when we designed our new park, we created an area called Hammock Grove, where you see literally people sharing in those hammocks, and then obviously the people in the different hammocks actually are strangers to each other, but they're sharing that experience. All that came, this idea, this design, came from our sharing with the public. We also very much believed in shared inspiration. Any architecture project is a shared collaboration between the designer and the client, but in our case, we were representing the public as well. And that beautiful sculpture you saw, thanks to the generosity of the Niarchos Foundation, commissioned by the artist Rachel White-Reed, has created a different meaning for the hill. This artist was asked to create this sculpture site-specific when we were literally at the drawing level, and she installed it as the hill was being built. So we've shared inspiration, not only we as the public sector and the client, but with the architect and, in this case, the artist. And this is another extraordinary artist who did a project on Governor's Island, Olafur Eliasson. This was part of a citywide project, the Waterfalls. But it actually, what it did for us at that moment in our evolution as a place was it created this grand sense of entrance. And we experienced it as an extraordinary work of art, but then it gave us the inspiration to create a permanent entrance to Governor's Island as you embarked on the boat, because we had felt that signature of what an artist had given us in that inspiration. And we very much believed in the sharing of experience. We all are very accustomed to sharing experience with our family and friends, but we took that a step further on Governor's Island by offering anyone the opportunity who had an experience they wanted to share with the public. We would give them a free space to do that. So whether it was miniature golf designed by artists, 9 holes changing every year, where we shared the creation created by the artist, but also, of course, the experience of playing mini golf. An urban farm where the farmer is sharing the experience of growing with children and adults from throughout the city. The shared experience of a festival. This was brought by the Dutch government several years ago, and you actually ate on a 400-foot table, signifying 400 years of friendship between the Dutch and American people while you were entertained. And this shared experience, an adventure playground created by a group of parents in New York City who wanted their children to be able to experience risk, something that they're not allowed to do in typical playgrounds. I would say if you haven't been to the play areas here, the same designer collaborated with us on Governor's Island. So we are excited about that here. And then artists transforming space, in this case, giant knitting, sharing experience, their experience as an artist, meeting with the public. And this sculpture by the artist Mark Hanforth, that shared experience because it's a sculpture, but it also became a place for children to frolic, for families to picnic, an experience shared because it was created by an artist. But artists and opening up a public space to the arts does something else. It shares meaning. This is a chapel on Governor's Island, a Gothic chapel about 100 years old, not in current use. We allowed artists to interpret this and create meaning. The artist Anthony McCall created a sculpture made out of actually the particles of dust, light and shadow, inside this building. And a few years later, the choreographer Reggie Wilson created a piece in this church. What is amazing about these moments is whether or not you were there, they are part of the meaning of this building. So it is no longer simply a church. Just the same way I was here last night and the canal was lit and there was a band playing on the stage, that moment stays with that canal. Whether you were there or I was there, it's part of the building up of meaning for this very new place, just as that dancer on Governor's Island created a new chapter of meaning. This notion that artists, by sharing the experience of public space with artists, is a vital one throughout our country. This is an extraordinary project in Gary, Indiana, a very challenged community in the Midwest. The artist Theaster Gates collaborating with the community to create a place of gathering, a community house called Art House. And a totally different setting, the Metropolitan Museum, Lee Mortomer, who's here and curated the festival for you this week in Athens, invited classical Indian dancers to perform at the Temple of Dendor in the Met. Again, I wasn't at this performance, but just seeing this image, I carry that with me when I'm at the Met during the day, that this temple has acquired a new layer of meaning, even beyond, of course, its origins in Egypt, its role in a gallery, and now a place of performance. So this idea that arts and freedom of expression create meaning to public spaces is one that's been resonant. And I want to talk for a moment, just before I conclude, about a place in America I think that we aspire to be our agora, and it's a place in Washington, D.C. And I want to go back in time, what for us is a long time, to a different moment of intense polarization. This was when our president was assassinated 150 years ago. And pretty much within days after the assassination, there was a movement to create a memorial for President Lincoln. And it was such a polarized moment that it actually took 50 years. And the space that was used was a blank space much like that blank of Governor's Island, actually a marshy swamp reclaimed at the Potomac River. This place had no meaning. And there was a competition, and an architect was hired, and they began to build, this is in 1914, a memorial to Lincoln. And the architect, Henry Bacon, very consciously chose a certain style of architecture, Greek Revival architecture. And at the time in America, we borrowed heavily from the Greeks in the building of banks and college campuses. But for this architect, it was a very specific decision to build a building that looked exactly like, of course, your Parthenon. And in the building that he built, there were 36 columns, Doric columns, one for each of the states of the Union, at the time that Lincoln was assassinated. And he very consciously believed and said, what better way existed to remember a man who struggled to defend democracy than to model his tribute after one found in the birthplace of democracy? And he very consciously called this a temple. So this was a public place. It was open to the public. It honored one of the most important Americans of our history. But it only began to acquire its meaning, and the meaning that we hold it for today, about 2 decades later, when it was used as a stage. And we need sound.
Genius draws no color line. And so it is fitting that Marian Anderson should raise her voice in tribute to the noble Lincoln whom mankind will ever honor. Miss Marian Anderson.
Anderson was one of America's most famous opera singers. Of course, she was African American and so had been denied the right to perform at Constitution Hall. Eleanor Roosevelt, our First Lady, gave permission for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. And in that song, those of us who are visiting from America may have noticed one word change in this song, which is not our national anthem, but one of our most popular songs. She changed "of thee I sing" to "of thee we sing." And with that concert and that change, she established the Lincoln Memorial as a place transformed forever by that moment of coming together in art, in her extraordinary voice, and in a gathering of peoples of every different color to celebrate her art and the Lincoln Memorial as a public space. Anderson returned 2 decades later to the Lincoln Memorial, to another moment that further transformed this place from being a quiet temple of contemplation to one of the most resonant public spaces in our nation.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Today, you can go to the Lincoln Memorial and stand exactly on the spot where Martin Luther King Jr. stood to give that speech. That plaque was put in about 10 years ago out of requests from the public who wanted to feel that connection to that moment in American history. And it is, again, this notion that as powerful as Lincoln's legacy was, it was only with these moments of art and political protest that the memorial acquired its role. And with the building of the memorial, a plan that had been put forth around first in the 18th century and then later in the 19th century to create basically America's Agora, was complete. The axis extending from the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool to the Washington Monument to the nation's capital. And it also established this place not only as a green place, but as a place used for many purposes, for protests. Dozens of protests have taken place on the National Mall, for expressions of our nation's commitment to free expression. Commemoration, this is the AIDS quilts being displayed covering the entire distance of the mall. Culture and celebration, the Folklife Festival. Of course, our nation's birthday, July 4th. And since 2008, the inauguration of our president. This became a moment of contention, actually, just this year, with a dispute about how many people attended the inauguration. But what I want to talk about is how another moment, not the inauguration, but the next day, picked up the legacy of the sharing of space with artists and people to create a new level of meaning. On January 21st, our nation experienced its largest day of protest. 3 million people gathered in cities around the country, including the most here in Washington at the National Mall. But what was interesting about this protest was not just its size, but that there was an element of it that involved the creating of art, I would say, and craft, where women, not all women, but women and men around the country began to knit hats. They called them pink pussy hats, and I will not explain that in detail, but I think you know what that refers to. And they wore these hats as they protested. And so this act of protest also became an act of creation, an act of culture. And when you think now about the National Mall, if you go to Washington, if you stand in the spot where Martin Luther King stood, you are standing in a place that was transformed by all of those generations, including the one earlier this year, and further cementing its role as a piece of culture. The pink pussy hat is now part of the permanent collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. So it has been an extraordinary privilege to be here this morning. I'm happy to take questions if people have them, and I look forward to participating in the discussions for the remainder of the day. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for us to be here in this majestic hall, and it is always a work in progress, exploring and discovering all the possibilities that this stage has to offer. So we're always working on modifying our own setup in order to give you the best possible experience as well. At this point, I would like to call the panelists for the next panel, specifically the plenary session 1, from the Agora to Commons, to Parisian Cafés to Tahrir Square, to Occupy Wall Street, the evolution of public space and its future.